Have you ever wondered why it took 2 atomic bombs to end World War II? It's a question that haunts history. To understand, we need to rewind, not just to 1945, but deep into the heart of Japanese culture and the brutal reality of the Pacific War. By the summer of 1945, Japan was on its knees. Its navy was at the bottom of the ocean, its air force was decimated, and its cities were being relentlessly firebombed. The American naval blockade was strangling the island nation, cutting off food, fuel, and vital resources. People were starving. From a purely logical standpoint, the war was lost. So why didn't they surrender? The answer lies in a complex web of military pride, political deadlock, and a deeply ingrained cultural code. Let's start with the military. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were not just fighting forces. They were the embodiment of the nation's spirit. For decades, they had known nothing but victory, conquering vast territories across Asia. Surrender was not just a strategic defeat. It was a spiritual one, an unthinkable stain on their honor. This mindset was rooted in the warrior code of Bushido, which emphasized death before dishonor. This wasn't just a romantic ideal, it was state policy. Soldiers were taught that being captured was the ultimate shame. We saw this play out in the horrific battles across the Pacific, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man, often taking their own lives rather than surrendering. This no-surrender policy was expected of the entire nation. The government itself was a tangled mess, paralyzed by infighting. It was dominated by a Big Six, a supreme council for the direction of the war. This council was split right down the middle. 3 members, known as the Peace Faction, including Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, recognized the writing on the wall. They knew Japan couldn't win and were secretly looking for a way out. But they were up against the War Faction, 3 hardliners from the Army and Navy who were adamantly opposed to surrender under any circumstances. They believed that one final decisive battle on Japanese soil, what they called Ketsugo, could inflict such massive casualties on the American invaders that the U.S. would be forced to offer more favorable peace terms. They were essentially preparing to sacrifice the entire population in a final apocalyptic battle. Their plan was terrifying. They were mobilizing everyone, men, women, and even children, into a national militia. They were being trained to fight with bamboo spears, kitchen knives, anything they could get their hands on. The idea was to turn the entire country into a fortress and make an American invasion so costly that it would break their will to fight. They truly believed that if they could kill 10 million Americans, they could secure a negotiated peace, not a surrender. And then there was the emperor. In the West, we often see Emperor Hirohito as a godlike figure with absolute power. But the reality was far more complicated. While revered as a divine descendant of the sun goddess, his political power was limited and often ceremonial. He was largely a figurehead, caught between the feuding factions of his own government. The military had been acting in his name for years, often without his explicit approval. Openly defying them could have triggered a coup, plunging Japan into an even deeper civil war. So, where did the Allies fit into this? In July 1945, the Allied leaders met at Potsdam and issued a declaration demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The terms were stark: surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. For the peace faction in Japan, this was a disaster. The term unconditional surrender was terrifying. It implied not just the end of the war, but the end of Japan as they knew it. Most critically, it said nothing about the fate of the emperor. Would he be tried as a war criminal? Would the entire imperial system, the very foundation of their culture for over 1,000 years, be abolished? This ambiguity was a major stumbling block. The one condition the peace faction desperately needed to secure was the preservation of the emperor's position. But the Potsdam Declaration offered no such guarantee. The hardliners seized on this. They portrayed unconditional surrender as a demand for national slavery and the destruction of their way of life. Prime Minister Suzuki, trying to walk a tightrope, publicly dismissed the declaration with the word mokusatsu, a famously ambiguous term that can mean to ignore or to treat with silent contempt. The world took it as a defiant rejection. The stage was set for tragedy. The military was convinced they still had a chance. Their intelligence, though flawed, suggested they could hold off an invasion. They underestimated the sheer industrial might of the United States and overestimated their own depleted capabilities. They were living in a bubble of their own propaganda, fueled by a belief in the spiritual power of the Japanese people, the Yamato Damashi. This brings us to the morning of August 6, 1945. The Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima, and in a single blinding flash, everything changed. A city was erased. The news that reached Tokyo was confused at first, but the scale of the destruction was undeniable. A new type of weapon had been used. Did this immediately trigger a surrender? No. Incredibly, the hardliners in the military council were largely unfazed. Some even tried to downplay it, arguing that while devastating, it was just a bigger bomb. They believed America could not have many such weapons, and that their plan for a final battle on the homeland was still viable. The deadlock continued. They were still willing to sacrifice millions of their own people. Then, 2 days later, on August 8th, a second hammer blow fell. The Soviet Union, which had remained neutral with Japan for most of the war, declared war and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. For many in the Japanese leadership, this was an even bigger shock than Hiroshima. The hope of using the Soviets to mediate a more favorable peace was instantly shattered. Now, they faced a two-front war against the world's two most powerful superpowers. The Red Army was slicing through their forces in China, and the threat of a communist invasion of the Japanese home islands suddenly became very real. For the conservative Japanese elite, a Soviet occupation was a far more terrifying prospect than an American one. The combination of Hiroshima's horror and the Soviet invasion finally broke the stalemate. Even with Nagasaki being bombed on August 9th, the military council was still deadlocked, 3-3. In an unprecedented move, Prime Minister Suzuki convened an imperial conference and asked the emperor himself to make the final decision. In a subterranean bunker deep beneath the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito, speaking in a quiet, high-pitched voice, did what no emperor had done in centuries. He intervened directly in politics. Citing the new and terrible weapon and his desire to save his people from further suffering, he stated that the terms of the Potsdam Declaration must be accepted. He said, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. It is time to bear the unbearable." The war was over. The emperor's word was absolute. His decision, broadcast to a stunned nation a few days later, was the only thing that could override the military's fanatical death before dishonor code. It gave soldiers and citizens the permission they needed to lay down their arms without feeling they had betrayed their nation or their honor. So why did Japan refuse to surrender before Hiroshima? It wasn't one single reason. It was the military's iron grip on power, a culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate shame, a paralyzed government, and the Allied demand for unconditional surrender that left no room for negotiation on the fate of their emperor. It took the combined shock of 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion to finally break the fever of fanaticism and allow the voice of peace to be heard. It's a sobering reminder of how ideology and honor, taken to their extremes, can lead a nation down a path of self-destruction. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this piece of history as compelling as I do, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. See you in the next one.